"You think wearing that cheap dress makes you his wife?" Chloe Vance grabbed Alara's wrist, hard in front of everyone, yanked her forward into the center of the ballroom floor, and laughed directly into her face. "Look at her, Marcus! Look at what you married!" 200 people froze. Glasses stopped midair. The music died. And Marcus Hayes, the man Alara had sacrificed everything for, stood 10 feet away, straightened his jacket, and turned his back on his own wife. That single moment of silence from one man destroyed 8 years of a woman's life. Subscribe now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. The Meridian Grand Hotel on Fifth Avenue was the kind of place where money didn't just talk, it sang. It sang in the crystal chandeliers that hung 40 feet above polished marble floors. It sang in the champagne flutes that cost more per bottle than most people paid in monthly rent. It sang in the murmur of conversations between men whose names appeared on buildings on foundation walls, on the kinds of documents that moved entire economies with a single signature. This was the annual Manhattan Real Estate Excellence Gala, a night when the most powerful developers in New York gathered to celebrate their own success, to shake the right hands, to be seen by the right eyes. And on this particular Friday evening in October, every single one of those powerful eyes would witness something they would never, for the rest of their lives, be able to forget. Alara Hayes stood near the far edge of the main reception room, holding a champagne flute she hadn't touched. She wasn't hiding exactly, but she wasn't drawing attention either. That was, she had learned over 8 years of marriage, the safest way to exist beside Marcus Hayes. Stay near enough that people couldn't say she was absent. Stay far enough that she didn't embarrass him. She wore a simple navy dress, knee-length, tasteful, understated. She had bought it 2 years ago for a charity dinner in Connecticut. She had almost bought something new for tonight, had even stood in the dressing room of a boutique on Madison Avenue for 40 minutes turning in front of the mirror, trying to decide between an emerald silk gown and a champagne-colored halter dress. But she had put both back on the rack and walked out. Somehow she had known. Somehow, some quiet part of her had understood that it didn't matter what she wore. It never had. Not to Marcus, not anymore. "You look like you're waiting for a bus," said a voice beside her. Alara turned. It was Dorothy Fenn, the wife of a commercial property attorney, a sharp-tongued woman in her late 60s who wore red lipstick like a weapon. Dorothy was one of the few people at these events who ever spoke to Alara directly, and she did it with the blunt warmth of a woman who had watched too many carefully constructed social performances to pretend she didn't see through all of them. "I feel like I'm waiting for a bus," Alara admitted quietly. Dorothy looked at her for a moment, really looked at her the way people rarely did, and then made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Where is he?" Alara's eyes moved instinctively across the room the way they always did. It took her approximately 4 seconds to find Marcus. He was standing near the center bar, broad-shouldered in his custom charcoal suit, laughing at something with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed confidence for so long it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. His hair was perfectly styled. His cufflinks caught the light. He looked as he always looked at these events, like the most important man in the room. And 3 inches to his left, her hand resting on his forearm with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had long since stopped pretending, stood Chloe Vance. Alara had known about Chloe for 7 months. She had known the way you know about a wound you don't look at directly through peripheral awareness, through the slight shift in temperature when certain names come up, through the way Marcus's phone had started going face down on every surface he set it on. She had suspected. Then she had confirmed. Then, in the strange, quiet way that prolonged pain eventually reshapes a person, she had simply continued. Chloe Vance was 29 years old. She had 400,000 followers on Instagram, a lifestyle brand built around what she called aspirational luxury, and a laugh that carried across rooms like it had been specifically engineered to do exactly that. She was wearing a gold dress tonight that left very little to imagination and suggested she had specifically chosen it to contrast against whatever Alara would be wearing, which Alara supposed bitterly had been a sound strategy. "That's her," Dorothy said. It wasn't a question. "That's her," Alara confirmed. Dorothy was silent for a moment. Then she said carefully, "You don't have to stay, you know." Alara looked at her champagne flute. The bubbles were still rising in slow, patient lines to the surface. Marcus is receiving the Developer of the Year award tonight. I'm supposed to be here. Supposed to be here, Dorothy repeated with exactly the kind of emphasis that made those 4 words carry the weight of an entire marriage. Ilara didn't answer. Across the room, Marcus said something she couldn't hear, and Chloe laughed that engineered laugh and leaned into him with her whole body. And Marcus did not step back. He did not create distance. He did not do any of the things that a man might do if he were even slightly aware that his wife was 20 feet away and watching. He simply put his hand on the small of Chloe's back and smiled. Something moved through Ilara's chest. Not rage. Not yet. It was something older and quieter than rage. It was the feeling of watching a truth you already knew become impossible to deny. She set her untouched champagne flute on the tray of a passing waiter. "Excuse me," she said to Dorothy. She didn't know why she walked toward him. Later she would ask herself that question many times, turning it over like a stone to see what was underneath. She had no plan. She had no prepared words. She moved across that marble floor because some part of her, some part that had been patient and quiet and careful for 8 years, had simply run out of patience and quiet and care. She reached Marcus from his right side, just outside his direct line of vision. He was mid-sentence describing something to the 2 men standing across from him. Something about permits, about a project in the financial district, and for 1 full second, he didn't register her at all. She watched his face in that second. She memorized it. That was the face of a man who had so completely rewritten the story of his life that he had edited her out of it entirely, and he hadn't even noticed the gap. "Marcus," she said. He turned. The shift in his expression was microscopic, a flicker so brief that most people would have missed it. But Ilara had spent 8 years studying that face, and she saw it. A flash of something, not guilt, not quite something closer to irritation. The irritation of a man whose evening has been interrupted. "Ilara," his voice was perfectly level. "I didn't realize you were standing there." "I know," she said. There was a pause. One of the other men, she thought his name was Whitmore, a developer from the Upper East Side, glanced between them with the finely calibrated discomfort of someone who sensed a situation without understanding it. Chloe had not looked away from Marcus. She was still standing at his side, her hand still on his forearm, and she was watching Ilara now with an expression that was almost curious, almost amused, like someone watching a small, confused animal wander into an unfamiliar room. "This is Chloe," Marcus said, and his voice was so perfectly casual, so deliberately ordinary, that for a moment Ilara genuinely could not process what was happening. "Chloe Vance. She's been consulting on the Meridian Project's social media strategy." Consulting. Social media strategy. Ilara looked at Chloe. Chloe looked back at her. And in Chloe's eyes, brown eyes framed by expensive lashes, warm and sharp. At the same time, Ilara saw something that she had not expected to see. Not guilt, not discomfort, triumph. Clean, comfortable, unhurried triumph, like a woman who has been waiting for this exact moment and finds it just as satisfying as she imagined it would be. "Hello," Chloe said pleasantly. "You must be the wife." The wife. Not Ilara. Not Mrs. Hayes. The wife delivered in the same tone you might use to say the furniture or the old car. "I am," Ilara said. Chloe smiled. It was a beautiful smile, technically speaking. "Marcus has told me so much about you." Marcus, for his part, said nothing. "I hope what he told you was kind," Ilara said. "Oh, of course." Chloe tilted her head slightly, and something shifted in her expression, something that sharpened without losing its pleasant surface. "He said you were very quiet, very private, that you don't really love these kinds of events." "That's true," Ilara said. "I can tell." Chloe let her gaze move briefly deliberately from Ilara's face to her dress and back again. It took less than 2 seconds and somehow communicated a complete assessment. "You know you didn't need to come tonight, really. Nobody would have expected you to." Ilara heard the words beneath the words. They were loud and clear, like a translation playing in a second channel underneath the polite surface of the conversation. "You don't belong here. You were never supposed to be here. Why are you making this difficult?" "I'm his wife," Ilara said. "I thought that might be reason enough." Something moved across Chloe's face, Not embarrassment, something closer to impatience, the impatience of a person who had expected less resistance than they were getting. Marcus cleared his throat. Chloe is actually a finalist for the Social Influence Award tonight. Did I mention that? He hadn't. He had not mentioned Chloe would be at this event at all, but Alara simply said, "Congratulations to Chloe," and felt the word leave her mouth like a stone dropping into still water. "Thank you." Chloe's smile widened slightly. Then she turned to Marcus, and the turn was deliberate and complete, a full pivot that placed her shoulder between herself and Alara like a closing door. "Baby, did you talk to Hendricks yet? He said he was going to be here by 8. Baby. The word landed in the silence between one heartbeat and the next. Whitmore made a small sound and looked at his shoes. The other man, Alara never got his name, suddenly found something fascinating in his champagne glass. Marcus's jaw tightened barely perceptibly and then relaxed. "Not yet," he said. "I'll find him." And then in a motion so smooth it might have been choreographed. Marcus turned his attention entirely to Chloe and away from his wife and continued a conversation that Alara was no longer part of. She stood there, 3 feet away, in her navy dress that had been perfectly appropriate for a charity dinner in Connecticut 2 years ago. And she stood there for a count of 4 seconds. She counted them 1, 2, 3, 4, while her husband spoke to his mistress about a man named Hendricks, and the 2 other men studied the middle distance with the concentrated fascination of people desperately pretending to be somewhere else. Then she walked away. She didn't know where she was going. She moved through the crowd with the automatic precision of someone who has learned to navigate public spaces while falling apart internally, nodding at people she half recognized, sidestepping clusters of conversation, moving toward the edge of the room, and then away from it. She ended up near a large window overlooking Fifth Avenue 6 floors down, where yellow taxis moved like slow fish through the October night. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. 8 years. She had given this man 8 years. She had given him more than that she had given him the years before. The years the version of herself that had still believed that choosing love over legacy was brave rather than naive. She had walked away from a family, from a name, from an entire infrastructure of protection and belonging because she had believed in Marcus Hayes when Marcus Hayes had been worth believing in. She remembered the first time she saw him. She had been 23 attending a charity auction in Boston on behalf of her family's foundation, the Van Allen Foundation, her mother's project, something Alara had been raised to care about and had cared about genuinely. Marcus had been there not as a donor, but as a caterer's assistant working the event to pay off the last of his graduate school debt, and he had spilled an entire tray of champagne flutes within arm's reach of Alara and spent the next 5 minutes apologizing with such genuine self-deprecating humor that she had laughed, really laughed, the kind of laughter that catches you off guard for the first time in months. He had been different then. She needed people to understand that. He had been different. He had been warm and funny and relentlessly, stubbornly optimistic, a man who talked about what he was going to build the way other people talked about what they had already built, with the absolute conviction of someone who had decided that reality was simply a blueprint that hadn't been executed yet. She had fallen in love with that conviction. She had believed in it the way you believe in something beautiful and fragile and maybe a little impractical, the way you believe in it harder, because somewhere you already know it might not last. She had gone against everything. Her father, Harrison Van Allen, had not raised his voice when she told him she intended to marry Marcus Hayes. Harrison Van Allen did not raise his voice. He had simply looked at her across the wide mahogany desk in his Boston study with his silver hair and his hands folded in that careful, permanent way of his and said, "Alara, think carefully about what you are trading and what you are trading it for." She hadn't listened. She had been 24 years old and she had been in love, and she had thought her father was a man who measured everything in columns of profit and loss and understood nothing about what it meant to choose a person over a position. She had thought she was brave. She had signed the prenuptial agreement. Marcus's family lawyer had presented a document that effectively separated her from the Van Allen financial estate for the duration of the marriage. And she had done it without flinching, because she had wanted to prove to Marcus and to herself, and maybe to her father, that she was not the kind of woman who needed a safety net. She had not spoken to her parents for 2 years after the wedding. Her choice. a young woman's proud, irreversible choice made in the full heat of conviction. She touched the window glass with one fingertip. Cold. Outside, a light rain had begun. From across the room, she heard Chloe's laugh again. She closed her eyes. She had tried in the early years to reach the version of Marcus she had married. She had tried when the coldness first appeared, that subtle incremental withdrawal that she had initially explained away as stress, as the pressure of building a business from nothing, as the normal friction of two people learning to share a life. She had tried when the business became successful and he began attending events without her or with her, but not truly with her, or with her, and somehow making her feel more alone than she would have felt staying home. She had tried when she first noticed the way he looked at her across a room, not with anger, not with dislike, but with something worse absence, as though the person standing in his wife's body was simply not someone he had any particular feeling about. She had never stopped trying. That she supposed was the most painful part of all of it. Not the betrayal itself, but the fact that she had seen it coming for so long, and had kept reaching anyway, kept offering the hand back to someone who had long since stopped reaching in return. "Mrs. Hayes." She opened her eyes. A young woman, one of the event's staff dark uniform warm face, was standing beside her. "Can I get you anything, water perhaps?" Alara looked at her. The young woman's expression was professional and kind and utterly neutral, and something about that neutrality, that clean, uncomplicated human kindness, made Alara's throat close unexpectedly. "No," she said. "Thank you. I'm fine." The young woman nodded and moved away. Alara was not fine. She made herself turn from the window. She made herself look back into the room at the lights, at the movement, at the 200 people in their expensive clothes, doing their expensive social calculations. She found Marcus again in 12 seconds. He was still with Chloe. They were no longer with Whitmore and the other man. They were alone now, or as alone as two people can be in a crowded room, and Marcus was leaning toward Chloe, with his whole body that lean that she recognized, that specific angle of attention that meant the person in front of him had his complete, absolute, undivided focus, and Chloe was smiling up at him with her hand on his chest. On his chest. In a room full of his professional colleagues. In a room where his wife was standing 30 feet away. The shaking in Alara's hand stopped. She noticed that. She noticed how completely suddenly still she became, as though some mechanism inside her that had been vibrating at the edge of its tolerance for a long time had finally just quit. Not broken, just done. She started walking. She didn't plan what she was going to say. She didn't know what she was going to say. She was aware that somewhere in the back of her mind a voice was saying with quiet urgency, "Alara, think carefully." But she was also aware that she had been thinking carefully for 8 years, and she was finished with careful. She reached them in under 30 seconds. Chloe saw her coming first. Alara watched the recognition move across Chloe's face, a quick recalibration, an adjustment of posture, a slight lifting of the chin that signaled preparation. Marcus turned a half-second later, and for just a moment, just one unguarded moment, his expression showed something raw and complicated that he immediately locked back behind his smooth, practiced surface. "Alara," he said. "I want to go home," she said. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds, which doesn't sound like much, but in a conversation between 3 specific people with that specific history in that specific room, it was an enormous silence. It had weight and shape and edges. "The award ceremony doesn't start for another 40 minutes, Marcus said. "I know. I need to be here." "I know that too," Alara said. "I said I want to go home. I didn't ask you to come with me." Something moved across Marcus's face. She couldn't name it precisely. It was in the region of surprise, the surprise of a man who had grown so accustomed to a particular dynamic that any deviation from it registered as a kind of malfunction. Chloe made a small sound. It wasn't exactly a laugh. It was the sound a person makes when they find something unexpectedly entertaining, a brief, involuntary expression of amusement that they decide not to fully suppress. And that sound, that small, barely there sound, was the thing that made Alara look directly at Chloe Vance for the first time that evening. Really look at her. Not in the sideways, careful, self-protective way she had been managing until now. Directly. Fully. "Did you find something funny?" Alara asked. Chloe blinked. Whatever she had expected, it wasn't that directness. She recovered quickly. She was good at recovering. Alara could see that she was a woman who had sharpened herself against difficulty and knew how to find her footing, and her expression settled back into something pleasant and slightly amused. "Not at all," Chloe said. "I was just thinking you have a lot of nerve." "I'm sorry. Coming over here and making a scene." Chloe's voice was still pleasant, still warm on the surface. "It's a little desperate, don't you think? It's a little—" She paused, tilting her head, as though searching for precisely the right word. "Sad." Alara didn't speak. "Marcus." Chloe continued, turning to him with the ease of a woman completely comfortable in the space she was occupying. "I think your wife needs some air. Maybe someone should call her a car." "Don't talk about me as if I'm not standing here," Alara said. "Then maybe you shouldn't be standing here," Chloe said, and now the pleasant surface cracked just slightly, and something harder showed through underneath. "This is a professional event, an important night, for Marcus. Maybe you could find somewhere to wait that's a little more appropriate for someone in your position." "My position," Alara repeated. Chloe's eyes moved over her that same brief, comprehensive assessment as before, but this time there was no pretense of subtlety about it. "The navy dress is sweet, very modest, very appropriate for for what you are." "And what am I?" Alara asked. There was a pause, and in that pause something crystallized. Later Alara would understand that this was the moment. Not the discovery of the affair, not the 8 years of incremental erasure. This moment. The moment when Chloe Vance opened her mouth and made a choice. "Invisible," Chloe said. The word dropped into the air between them and expanded. "Invisible," Chloe said again, more deliberately. "That's what you are. You've been invisible in this marriage for years. Everybody knows it. His colleagues know it. His friends know it." She paused. "I think deep down, you know it too." From her peripheral vision, Alara was aware that the nearest cluster of people, 456, had gone quiet, were listening. "Chloe," Marcus said very quietly. "What?" Chloe's voice was still level, still pleasant, still that infuriating combination of cruelty and composure. "I'm just saying what everyone in this room is already thinking. She doesn't belong here. She never did. And the kindest thing, the honest thing is to just say it clearly instead of letting her keep standing around like—" She glanced at Alara one more time, like baggage that got left at the wrong stop. Alara felt something happen in her chest, something that she could not immediately classify. It wasn't pain exactly. It was the sensation of a door closing, not slamming, not breaking, but closing with a soft and final click on a room she would never again need access to. She felt the heat behind her eyes. She tried very hard not to let it happen. She tried with everything she had. But 8 years is a long time, and the body eventually keeps its own accounting. 1 tear. Just one. Moving down the left side of her face in the bright, merciless light of the Meridian Grand Hotel ballroom. She watched Chloe see it. She watched the expression on Chloe's face in the moment of seeing it, a flash of something that for just an instant looked almost like satisfaction. And then Chloe did something that Alara would carry with her for the rest of her life. She smiled, slowly, fully, and she turned to the nearest group of people, turned to them specifically, deliberately making sure they were watching, and she said loud enough for everyone within 15 feet to hear, "See, this is what I mean. She doesn't belong in this world. Look at her. She's crying because she finally understands it." The nearest conversation stopped. Heads turned. The radius of silence expanded outward like a ripple. Alara stood in the center of it, alone, 1 tear on her face, and the entire room watching, and Marcus, her husband of 8 years, the man she had traded everything for, standing 2 feet away from her and saying absolutely nothing, not one word. Not her name, not stop, not the basic fundamental human syllable of defense that even a stranger might have offered to another person being publicly dismantled. Nothing. And in that nothing, Alara finally understood everything. Not the affair. She had known about the affair. Not even the lovelessness she had felt that from a long way off and had been bracing against it for years. She understood in this moment, with a clarity so complete it was almost peaceful, that Marcus Hayes had not simply fallen out of love with her. He had decided at some point in the last 8 years that she was not a person worthy of defense, that she was exactly what Chloe had just called her baggage, something to be left behind without ceremony, without apology, without even the dignity of a private conversation. She had been reduced, not by cruelty. Cruelty she could have fought. She had been reduced by indifference, and that was something much harder to argue against. Another tear now. She couldn't stop them anymore. She pressed her lips together. She looked at Marcus one more time, one long, steady look that asked a question she already knew the answer to. He looked away. That was all. He simply looked away. And somewhere in the deepest, most foundational part of Alara, Van Allen Hayes, in the place that was older than her marriage, older than her choices, older than the version of herself that had been quietly erased by 8 years of being loved, and then being endured, and then being forgotten, something that had been sleeping for a very long time opened its eyes. It was not sadness. It was not even rage. Not yet. It was awareness, pure and cold and absolute. The awareness that she had been treating her own life like a debt she owed someone else. That she had handed herself over in pieces, her name, her family, her inheritance, her dignity to a man who had spent the last several years leaving those pieces on the floor without bothering to notice they had fallen. That she had confused love with endurance and endurance with strength, and strength with suffering quietly in a navy dress at a gala on Fifth Avenue, while a woman in a gold dress told 200 people that she was invisible, and her husband found something fascinating to look at on the opposite wall. She was not invisible. She had never been invisible. She had simply been surrounded by people who could not afford to see her clearly. That was about to change. She didn't know yet exactly how. She didn't know what would walk through those wide ballroom doors in less than 2 hours. She didn't know that the name she had spent 8 years trying to leave behind was at this very moment moving toward her through the October night in the back of a black car on Fifth Avenue. She didn't know that everything Chloe had just said, every word of it, delivered with such comfortable confidence, was about to become the most catastrophic mistake any person in that room had ever made. She knew only this: the door inside her had closed. And something else, something she had no name for yet, had just opened. She reached up. She touched the single tear on her cheek. She pressed it away with the pad of her thumb, and she straightened her spine. And she stood there in her navy dress, in her modest heels, with her eyes clear and her hands finally completely still, and she looked at the ballroom around her, at all 200 faces that were pretending not to stare, while staring at Chloe's smile, at Marcus's averted gaze, at the chandeliers above, and the marble below, and the city moving in the rain-dark night beyond the high windows. She looked at all of it, and she waited. She did not cry again. That one tear, the one Chloe had made a spectacle of, the one Marcus had watched fall without moving a single muscle in her defense, that was the last one. Alara had made that decision standing in the center of that ballroom with 200 pairs of eyes pretending not to look at her, and she had made it the way you make decisions when you have finally completely run out of alternatives. No more tears. Not here. Not for them. She found a chair near the back wall beside a tall potted arrangement that gave her a partial barrier from the main floor, and she sat down and she folded her hands in her lap, and she breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old and had scraped both knees falling off a bicycle on the gravel path behind their estate in Connecticut. Her mother's voice, precise and warm. You feel it, then you breathe. Then you decide what you do next, in that order, always in that order. Her mother, Isabel Van Allen, a woman who had once told a United States senator in a room not entirely unlike this one that his opinion of her foundation strategy was noted and would be given exactly the weight it deserved. Delivered with a smile so serene, it had taken the man 30 seconds to understand he'd been dismissed. Alara had not spoken to her mother in 14 months. That thought settled into her chest alongside everything else, and she let it sit there because there was nowhere else to put it right now. Across the room, the award ceremony was beginning. She could see the MC taking the stage, a tall man in a black tuxedo, with the polished energy of someone who made his living being enthusiastic about other people's accomplishments. She could see Marcus moving toward the front of the room, Chloe at his side, the two of them threading through the crowd with the easy coordination of two people who had long since stopped performing any pretense of separation. She watched people notice. She watched the small recalibrations, the slight widening of eyes, the brief murmured exchange between spouses, the careful avoidance of looking directly at Alara, and then the inability to stop looking. She was aware with a clarity that was almost detached that she had become the evening's secondary entertainment. The sad wife in the back, the woman who cried, the one the beautiful mistress had made a point of in front of everyone. She knew what they were thinking. Some of them were thinking it with genuine pity, and some were thinking it with the private satisfaction that other people's humiliations can produce in people who would never admit to feeling that satisfaction. And some, she could see this in a few faces, the ones who had been around long enough to recognize a specific kind of silence were thinking something more careful, more watchful. Dorothy Fenn was one of those. She found Alara 20 minutes into the ceremony and sat down beside her without asking, without ceremony, with the direct efficiency of a woman who had decided something and was acting on it. "I want to ask you something," Dorothy said, keeping her voice low, her eyes on the stage. "And I want you to know I'm asking it as someone who has been watching this industry for 31 years and has seen a lot of things that did not end the way people expected them to." "Ask," Alara said. "Your family name," Dorothy said. "Before Hayes. I've been trying to place it all evening. You look familiar in a way I can't account for. I know I haven't met you before tonight. But something about the way you carry yourself." She paused. "What was your name before?" Alara looked at her. Dorothy was watching the stage, giving Alara the privacy of not being directly observed, and that small consideration, that simple human thoughtfulness, made the answer come more easily than it might have otherwise. "Van Allen," Alara said. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Dorothy did not move, did not change her posture, but something shifted in the quality of her stillness, a shift so subtle that only someone paying very close attention would have caught it. "Harrison Van Allen's daughter," Dorothy said. "Not a question." "Yes." Dorothy was quiet for another moment. Then she said very carefully, "Does Marcus know?" "He knew when we married," Alara said. "He chose over time to forget." Dorothy turned to look at her then, directly, fully, with the kind of attention that most people reserved for moments of genuine consequence. And in Dorothy's eyes, sharp and dark, and 31 years deep in a world built on money and connection, and the precise knowledge of who mattered and who didn't, Alara saw something she had not expected to see. Not pity, not the recalibrated wariness of someone adjusting their social position relative to new information, something that looked almost exactly like relief, like the satisfaction of a puzzle resolving. "Oh," Dorothy said quietly. "Oh, that is something." From the stage, the MC's voice rose, "And the Developer of the Year award goes to Marcus Hayes of Hayes Capital Development." The applause started. Alara watched her husband walk to the stage. He was smiling that wide, practiced conference room smile that she had once found genuinely charming, and now recognized as the expression of a man performing the version of himself he had decided the world deserved to see. He shook hands with the MC. He accepted the award, a heavy crystal piece, angular and expensive, and he held it up, and the applause swelled, and Chloe, in the front row, was clapping with her whole body and looking up at him with an expression that Alara supposed was meant to convey pride, but landed from where Alara was sitting more like possession. "I want to thank everyone who made this possible," Marcus said into the microphone. His voice carried easily through the room. He was good at this, had always been good at this, the public ease, the performed humility, the carefully constructed gratitude. "This award belongs to my entire team, every person who believed in the vision from the beginning." He did not look at Alara. He did not say her name. He did not say wife or partner or the woman who stood beside me when I had nothing and believed in me before I had given her a single concrete reason to do so. He said team. He said vision. He talked for 3 minutes about a building in the financial district and what it represented for the future of New York development. And then he walked off the stage back to Chloe, and the moment was over. Dorothy put her hand briefly over Alara's, said nothing, then stood and walked away. Alara sat with the weight of that for a long moment. Then she stood too, because sitting still had started to feel like something she couldn't afford anymore. She moved toward the edge of the room, toward the wide corridor that led to the hotel's main lobby, needing a minute of air that didn't carry the specific density of that ballroom. She was halfway there when she heard her name not called, but said in a low voice behind and to her left. Elara Hayes. She turned. A man she didn't recognize was standing near the corridor entrance. He was somewhere in his early 50s, compact and precise in his bearing, with the kind of face that suggested a career spent evaluating things quickly and accurately. He was wearing a hotel staff lanyard, but the way he was standing had nothing to do with hospitality. "I'm sorry," she said. "There are some people asking for you," the man said. "At the main entrance. They asked me to find you personally." He paused. "They said to tell you the roses in the south garden are still blooming." Elara went completely still. The roses in the south garden. It was the most private thing she had ever shared with her mother. A phrase from her childhood, from a specific afternoon when she was 9 years old, sitting in her mother's garden in Connecticut, while Isabel Van Allen taught her the names of every variety of rose in the south garden, Latin and common, both because Isabel believed that knowing the proper name of a thing was the first step toward understanding it. It was a phrase they had used afterward as a kind of shorthand, a private signal between them, meaning, "I am here. I have not forgotten you. Everything that matters is still standing." No one else alive knew that phrase. No one else alive could have sent it. Her heart rate changed completely. Not spiked, changed. Became something steadier and deeper than it had been a moment ago, like a current shifting direction in deep water. "Who?" she began. "Main entrance," the man said quietly. "They're waiting." She looked at him for one more second. Then she turned and walked toward the lobby. She was aware as she moved through the corridor and out into the lobby's open space that her mind was running calculations at a speed she hadn't felt in years. Her parents, here, tonight. The question was not why she was beginning to understand why in the way you understand something that has been moving toward you for a long time and has simply now arrived. The question was how they had known, how they had found her, how, after 14 months of silence that she had built and maintained and defended, like a structure she was afraid to examine too closely, they had walked through that silence and come to find her in this specific hotel on this specific night. She stepped into the lobby. It was quieter here, the gala's sound reduced to a distant, muffled current. A few hotel guests moved through. A concierge spoke quietly on the phone behind the desk, and near the main entrance, standing with the absolute stillness of two people who had all the time in the world and the resources to demonstrate it, were Harrison and Isabel Van Allen. Her father had not changed except that he had. He was 71 now, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that came not from vanity, but from a lifetime of understanding that how you stood in a room communicated something before you ever opened your mouth. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie casual by his standards, which meant he had come quickly without the full architecture of preparation. His eyes found her the moment she stepped into the lobby, and they stayed on her with the focused, unbroken attention of a man who had been waiting for this moment for a long time and intended to be fully present for it. Her mother was beside him. Isabel Van Allen, at 68, was still the most elegantly composed person in any room she entered, not because she tried, but because composure was simply the medium she lived in, the way musicians live in sound. She was wearing a cream-colored coat, and her hair was the same rich silver it had been for the last decade, and she was looking at Elara with an expression that Elara needed 3 full seconds to read correctly. Not anger, not judgment, not the complicated architecture of a parent who has been waited out and is now trying to decide whether to acknowledge it. Fear, the specific controlled, furious fear of a parent who has heard something about their child and gotten on a plane. "Elara," her mother said. One word, just her name. But the way Isabel Van Allen said it, the way it carried 8 years and 14 months, and the particular weight of love that has been sitting in a closed room for too long, hit Elara somewhere below rational thought, somewhere old and essential. She crossed the lobby in 8 steps, and when her mother's arms came around her, she let them. Oh, she did not cry. She had made that decision. But she pressed her face briefly into her mother's shoulder and closed her eyes and breathed, and for approximately 4 seconds, She was not Alara Hayes, the invisible wife, the woman in the navy dress that Chloe Vance had made a public example of. She was Alara Van Allen, 9 years old, learning the Latin names of roses in her mother's garden in Connecticut, in a world that had not yet asked her to be smaller than she was. Her father put his hand on her shoulder. Firm, brief, exactly the way Harrison Van Allen expressed everything he didn't have words for in the moment, which was most things. Then she stepped back, because she was not 9 years old, and there was a ballroom 40 feet away where things were still happening. "How did you know?" she asked. Her parents exchanged a look, the kind of look that communicated a complete paragraph in under a second. "Dorothy Fenn called me," her mother said, 40 minutes ago. Alara absorbed this. Dorothy. Of course, Dorothy, who had asked her name with the careful attention of someone who already suspected the answer and needed confirmation. Dorothy, who had put her hand over Alara's and then stood up and walked away to somewhere quiet to make a call. "She told you what happened," Alara said. "She told us enough," her father said. His voice was the same as it had always been, low and precise and carrying the particular gravity of a man who chose his words not because he couldn't find more of them, but because he had learned a long time ago that more was rarely better. "She also told us who was in that room, what deals were on the table, what Marcus was receiving tonight, and from whom." He paused. "Dorothy knows the financial architecture of this city better than most banks." What she described, her mother said carefully, was unacceptable. Alara looked at her parents, at her father's face, which had the controlled, banked expression of a man who had made several decisions in the last 40 minutes and was not going to be talked out of any of them. At her mother's eyes, which were warm and sharp and carrying something that Alara had spent 14 months trying not to miss. "He said he wants a divorce," Alara said. She heard herself say it and understood that she had needed to say it plainly to someone before she could figure out what she felt about it. Her father nodded slowly. "Did he? In front of people?" "Not yet. He hasn't said it yet in public, but he will. I think that's where tonight is going." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then we should go back in." "Harrison," her mother said in the tone that meant she was not disagreeing, but requesting a beat of consideration. "Isabel," her father said, in the tone that meant the consideration was noted and the decision remained. Alara looked at them both. Something was happening in her chest, not the closing door feeling of the ballroom, but something opening, something that had been shut for a long time, pushing against its frame from the inside. "Before we go back in," she said, "I need you to understand something." Her parents waited. "I'm not walking back into that room to be rescued," she said. "I'm walking back in because I am done being invisible, and I need it to be my choice, my walk, my moment. Not," she paused, finding the exact word, "not a cavalry." Her father looked at her for a long moment, and then for the first time since she had crossed the lobby, something shifted on his face. The controlled surface and the banked decision, all of it was still there. But underneath it, visible for just a moment, was something she had not seen on his face since she was very young. Something that looked precisely and unmistakably like pride. "No cavalry," he said. "We walk in. You lead." "I lead," she confirmed. Her mother reached out and touched her face just briefly, just her fingertips against Ilara's cheek where that single tear had been, said nothing, put her hand down. And the three of them turned toward the ballroom. They were 20 feet from the entrance when they heard Chloe's voice carrying through the open doors, that voice, that specific register of amplified confidence, and Alara understood with a certainty that required no elaboration that Chloe had found a microphone again, or something near enough to one, because the room beyond those doors had gone very quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone is performing for them. "I just think," Chloe was saying loud and bright, and laced with the kind of false reluctance that is actually eagerness in a different costume, that sometimes the kindest thing is honesty. And honestly, some women are meant for this world, and some women, bless their hearts, are just not built for it. And you can tell, you can just tell. Laughter, a smattering of it, uncomfortable at the edges but present. Alara did not slow her pace. She kept walking, steady, forward. Her parents 2 steps behind, as agreed. She reached the entrance. She stepped through. The first person to see her was a woman near the door whose name she didn't know, and the woman's eyes moved from Alara's face to the space behind her, and Alara watched the exact moment the recognition hit. Watch the woman's expression do something complicated and involuntary, something that happened faster than thought, before social composure could smooth it over. The woman turned to the person beside her and said something very quickly, very low. And that small motion, that instinctive reflexive turning of one person to another, began to move through the room the way these things move, not a wave, more like a change in air pressure, invisible and complete. Chloe was still talking. She was standing near the center of the room with a champagne glass in one hand and the attention of at least 30 people around her, and she was performing. There was no other word for it. She was giving a performance with herself as both writer and star, and she had not yet noticed the change in the room's temperature. "I mean, Marcus is a visionary," Chloe continued, "and a visionary needs someone who can match that energy. Someone who understands this world, not someone who shows up in—" She paused for effect for the laugh she expected, department store Navy. The expected laugh did not come. Something was happening instead. A silence with a different texture than the one before it. A silence that had direction. Chloe felt it. Alara watched her feel it the way confidence can tip in an instant from certainty into the first flickering awareness of miscalculation. Chloe's eyes moved around the nearest circle of faces, looking for the laugh, finding instead expressions she could not immediately read. She turned slightly, following the direction of people's eyes, and she saw Alara, standing at the entrance to the ballroom, in her navy dress, spine straight, eyes clear. And behind her Harrison Van Allen, Isabel Van Allen, standing with the absolute undemonstrative calm of two people who had been the most powerful presence in every room they had entered for the last 4 decades and knew it, and had no need to announce it, because rooms like this one, rooms built on money and connection and the precise knowledge of who mattered, already knew their names. Chloe's champagne glass stopped halfway to her mouth. From somewhere across the room, a single voice male, older, unmistakably recognizing, said, "Is that Harrison Van Allen?" And the question, once asked aloud, ran through the room like electricity through water. Marcus heard it. Alara watched him hear it. Watched him turn from the conversation he was in, a conversation with 2 investors she recognized from his board meetings, and she watched his eyes find her and then move past her and then stop. And she watched what happened to his face in the moment he understood what he was seeing. It was not a small thing what happened to his face. She had imagined this moment in the abstract without ever expecting it to actually arrive. She had imagined it as something that would feel like triumph or vindication or the clean satisfaction of a score being settled. But standing here now, watching the color leave Marcus Hayes's face and his jaw do something complicated and his hands, his steady conference room hands, do something they had never done in 8 years of her observation, which was lose their composure completely. She found that what she felt was not triumph. It was sorrow, old and deep and real, for the woman she had been when she had believed in him, for the 8 years, for all of it. And then her father was at her side, not ahead exactly as agreed, and her mother moved to her left, and Alara took one breath, and she walked forward into the room that had watched her break. Chloe had not moved. She was still standing where she had been, champagne glass now hanging from her fingers at a forgotten angle, and her face was doing something that Alara suspected Chloe's face had never done in any public setting in her entire adult life. It was showing without any filter or control exactly what she was feeling, which was terror. The specific sudden terror of a person who has built an entire evening on the assumption that the person they were targeting had no power, and has just discovered in the most public way imaginable that they were catastrophically wrong. Marcus took a step forward, his mouth opened. Alara looked at him, just looked at him from 10 feet away with the full, clear weight of everything she now understood and everything she had already decided. And whatever was in that look, whatever it communicated, it stopped him where he stood. Her father came even with her. He looked at Marcus Hayes, a look that contained no emotion that Alara could identify, which somehow made it more devastating than anger would have been, and he said very quietly, very precisely, "I think we need to have a conversation." Marcus said nothing. Her mother looked at Chloe. Isabel Van Allen had a particular way of looking at people who had behaved badly in rooms where she was present. It was not contemptuous. It was simply appraising the look of a person examining something and determining its value, and finding the assessment complete in under 2 seconds. Chloe received that look and seemed to physically shrink inside her gold dress. And the ballroom, the Meridian Grand Ballroom with its chandeliers and its champagne and its 200 people who made their living, knowing who mattered in this city, went completely, absolutely, reverberantly silent. Not the silence of shock, the silence of recognition. The silence that happens when a room full of powerful people all understand simultaneously that they have been watching the wrong person all evening. That the woman in the navy dress they dismissed, the wife who cried the one the beautiful mistress called invisible and baggage and middle-class nobody, that woman was standing in front of them, with Harrison and Isabel Van Allen at her side. And every deal, every connection, every carefully constructed relationship in this room ran through the name she had been carrying quietly for 8 years. Van Allen, the woman they had watched break, had never been breakable at all. And Chloe Vance, who had grabbed Alara's wrist in front of everyone who had made her the evening's entertainment, who had smiled while one tear ran down a wife's face and called it proof that she didn't belong, stood in the center of that silence, with her champagne glass tilting toward the floor, and understood with the full weight of a catastrophic miscalculation exactly what she had done. The silence lasted exactly 7 seconds. Alara counted them. Not because she was afraid of the silence she had made her peace with silence long before tonight, but because she understood that what happened in the 8 seconds after that silence would determine everything, and she wanted to be ready. Marcus broke first, not with words, with movement. He took 2 steps toward her and her parents with his hands, slightly raised palms open, the universal gesture of a man who needs to control a situation and is smart enough to know that aggression won't work, and is therefore defaulting to something that looked like openness but was actually calculation. She had seen that gesture 100 times. Across dinner tables in meetings with contractors, in arguments that he had decided he was going to win before they started. "Harrison," he said. His voice was steady. She gave him that. The man had extraordinary composure under pressure, always had. It was one of the things she had once admired most about him. I wasn't aware you were going to be here tonight." Her father looked at him, just looked at him, the way you look at a door you've already decided to walk through. "I know you weren't," Harrison said. 3 words, delivered with the specific economy of a man who understood that when you hold every card, you don't need to explain your hand. Marcus's jaw tightened. "I think there may have been some misunderstanding this evening. Things were said that—" "Marcus!" Her father's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It simply stopped him the way a wall stops you, without drama and without apology. "We'll have that conversation, but not here and not now and not on your timeline." He glanced around the room, a brief, complete survey that managed to acknowledge every significant face in it simultaneously. "Tonight, my daughter is going to enjoy the remainder of this event. You're going to give her the space to do that. And tomorrow morning, you and I are going to sit down with our respective attorneys and have a very different kind of conversation." The word attorneys landed in the silence like a stone in still water. Alara watched it hit Marcus, watched him absorb the implication, not just the word itself, but everything behind it. The resources behind it, the infrastructure of legal and financial power that the name Van Allen could mobilize with a single phone call. She watched him understand in real time that the landscape he had been operating in for the last 8 years had just shifted completely beneath his feet, and that the ground he had been so confident standing on was not the ground he had believed it to be. "Of course," Marcus said. His voice had changed. "Not broken." Marcus Hayes did not break in public, she knew that, but the timbre of it had shifted subtly from the register of a man managing a situation to the register of a man being managed by one. Her mother touched her arm lightly. "Come, walk with me." They moved together toward the center of the room, and Alara was aware, acutely, completely aware of what was happening around her as they walked. The crowd was parting, not dramatically, not like a movie moment where people leap out of the way, but naturally, the way crowds move when the gravitational center of a room changes, when people instinctively reorient toward power the way flowers turn toward light. She had grown up watching her mother walk into rooms this way, and had spent 8 years trying to forget what it felt like. The forgetting she understood now had never actually worked. Dorothy Fenn appeared at the edge of her vision, and when their eyes met, Dorothy gave her a single nod, the nod of a woman who made a phone call 40 minutes ago and considers the outcome satisfactory. Alara returned it, no words necessary. Then Chloe spoke. It was the wrong move. Everyone in the room could feel it. The collective intake of breath that happens when someone is about to make a situation significantly worse for themselves. But Chloe either couldn't feel it or had decided that retreat was more dangerous than advance. Either way, she spoke. "Excuse me." Her voice came from 10 feet away, still carrying that practiced brightness, but with something fraying at its edges, now something that sounded like a person who has made a bet and is watching it go wrong and is trying to double down before the table closes. "I don't think I've had the pleasure. I'm Chloe Vance. I've been working closely with Marcus on the Meridian project." The room held its breath. Isabel Van Allen turned to look at Chloe. The full measured, complete turn of a woman who has decided to give someone her attention and intends them to understand exactly what receiving that attention means. She looked at Chloe for a moment that stretched 3 seconds past comfortable. "I know who you are," Isabel said. Her voice was warm. That was the thing about Isabel Van Allen that people always underestimated. The warmth was real, it was genuine, and it coexisted without any contradiction alongside a clarity of judgment that could take the paint off walls. "I've been aware of you for some time, Ms. Vance." Chloe blinked. "Oh, well, it's lovely to." "You called my daughter invisible," Isabel said. Not loud, not aggressive, simply stated. A fact placed on the table between them as clean and final as a closing argument. The breath the room had been holding came out all at once. Chloe's prepared smile did something complicated. It tried to stay where it was and couldn't quite manage it. That was taken out of context. It was a, "You called her baggage," Isabel continued in the same warm, precise tone. "You told a room full of her husband's colleagues that she didn't belong in their world. You did this while she was standing 3 feet from you, and then you smiled while she cried." A pause, brief and surgical. "Did I miss anything?" Chloe opened her mouth, closed it. The champagne glass in her hand had developed a faint tremor. "Because I want to make sure I have the complete picture," Isabel said. "I find it's important to be accurate." "Mom," Alara said quietly. Not to stop her, she had learned a long time ago that Isabel Van Allen did not stop mid-thought, but because she needed her mother to know she was still choosing her own footing in this, that she was present, that she was not behind Isabel, but beside her. Isabel glanced at her, the briefest glance warm and acknowledging, then back to Chloe. "I'm not going to make a scene," Isabel said to Chloe, and somehow that sentence in that tone was the most devastating thing she could have said. "That's not who we are. But I want you to understand something very clearly, Ms. Vance, so that there's no confusion later about whether you were informed." She paused. "My daughter's name opens every door in this city that matters. Every foundation grant, every preservation board, every financial institution with a Van Allen endowment, and there are more of those than you would find comfortable to count. The people in this room who matter, and some of them matter very much, are going to remember this evening. They're going to remember what was said, and they're going to make their decisions accordingly." Chloe had gone the color of copy paper. "Have a good evening," Isabel said and turned away, and the turn was so complete and so final that it was more devastating than anything else could have been because it communicated with perfect clarity that Chloe Vance was now someone Isabel Van Allen had already finished thinking about. Alara watched Chloe standing there in the wreckage of that exchange. The gold dress, the engineered laugh, nowhere in evidence. The 400,000 followers and the lifestyle brand and the aspirational luxury completely absent as functional armor, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, something quieter than satisfaction and more complicated, something in the neighborhood of pity crossed with the sober recognition that cruelty always carried a bill, and the bill always came due. Then her father was at her elbow, and his voice was low and close. "There's someone you need to speak with. Robert Carver is here." Robert Carver. Alara processed the name and its weight simultaneously. Robert Carver was the chairman of the Northeast Development Coalition, the body that had just given Marcus his award, and more relevantly, the body that governed the licensing and certification of every major real estate development project in the tri-state area. He was also, though this was not publicly advertised, a man whose family foundation had received Van Allen funding for 11 consecutive years and who had attended her parents' anniversary dinner in Boston 3 times. He saw everything, her father said. He came to find me. He had my number from the foundation gala in April. What did he say? Her father's expression shifted slightly. He said he needed to have a conversation about the Meridian Project's licensing review, and that he wanted to do it tonight. Alara understood the full weight of what that meant. The Meridian Project, the financial district development that Marcus had just described as his crowning achievement, the project that the Developer of the Year award was explicitly recognizing, was currently in the middle of a licensing review. A review that under normal circumstances was a formality. A review that under changed circumstances was not. "Where is he?" she asked. "Corner table near the east wall. He's waiting." Alara turned. She found Robert Carver exactly where her father said a heavy-set man in his mid-60s with a white beard and the patient, watchful quality of someone accustomed to making consequential decisions in quiet rooms. He saw her looking and gave her a nod that was direct and unambiguous. She crossed the room toward him, and as she walked, she was aware that Marcus was watching her. She could feel it without looking the specific quality of his attention, which she had spent 8 years learning the texture of. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Carver, and she kept walking. "Alara," Carver said when she reached him. He stood briefly as she arrived, old-school courtesy that she suspected was not entirely automatic tonight. "It's been years." "It has," she agreed, and sat down across from him. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I've attended 3 of these events with Marcus Hayes over the last 4 years. I knew you were his wife. I never made a point of speaking with you. That was a failure on my part, and I want to acknowledge it." "You didn't know," Alara said. "I should have asked," he said. "Someone in my position should always ask." He folded his hands on the table. "The Meridian Project. I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to understand it's a professional question, not a personal one." "Ask." "Your family's foundation has a historic preservation mandate. The Meridian Project, as currently designed, requires the demolition of the Aldrich Building on Fulton Street. The Aldrich Building is on the preliminary list for the Van Allen Foundation's next preservation grant cycle." He looked at her steadily. "Were you aware of that?" She was aware of it. She had been aware of it for 4 months, had read it in the Foundation's quarterly preliminary report, which she still received despite everything, because her father had quietly maintained her on the distribution list without making an issue of it. She had noticed the Aldrich Building's name on the list. She had noticed that Marcus's project would require its demolition. She had said nothing because she had been, even then, even 4 months ago, still trying to protect something that was already gone. "I was aware," she said. Carver nodded slowly. "The Licensing Review Committee meets in 3 weeks. The Van Allen Foundation's position on the Aldrich Building will be relevant to that review." "I understand. I want to be clear," Carver said. "I'm not asking you to do anything improper. The Foundation's position should be whatever the Foundation genuinely believes is right. I'm simply making sure you know that your voice in this, your family's voice, carries weight that perhaps hasn't been exercised recently." "It's about to be," Alara said. Something shifted in Carver's expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was the look of a man who has assessed a situation and found it resolving in a direction he considers correct. "Good," he said simply. She stood. He stood with her. They shook hands, and the handshake was brief and firm and meant something specific to everyone who was watching, which was most of the room, because most of the room had been watching Alara Hayes with a very different kind of attention for the last 20 minutes than they had been giving her for the previous 2 hours. She turned from the table and almost walked directly into Marcus. He was standing 3 feet away. He had followed her across the room. She had felt him doing it, had registered it at the edges of her awareness, and he was standing close enough now that this was a private conversation, whether either of them had chosen it or not. His composure, she noticed, had developed a crack, not visible to someone who didn't know his face, visible to her immediately. What did Carver want? He asked. A conversation, she said. About what? She looked at him, fully directly, with the same clear weight she had given him when she walked back into the ballroom and he had stopped mid-step. About the Aldrich building, she said. She watched the implications land, watched his face do the math, the Aldrich building, the preservation list, the foundation, the licensing review, and watched the moment the total came in and he understood what it meant for the Meridian Project. The project he had just accepted an award for. The project his entire next phase of business was built around. Elara, he said, and his voice had changed. Again, changed past the controlled register, past the managed register, into something she had not heard from him in years. Something that was underneath all the composure and the calculation, genuinely afraid. Whatever you're thinking about doing, I'm thinking about doing my job, she said. The Foundation's job, which I should have been paying more attention to for the last several years. That building is not historically significant enough to— Robert Carver thinks it might be, she said. And so does the preliminary committee, and as of tonight, so do I. You'd do that. His voice was low and tight. You'd tank my entire project because of one night. She held his gaze. No, she said. I'd support the Foundation's legitimate preservation mandate because it's the right thing to do. The fact that your project conflicts with it is a consequence of the choices you made, not the ones I'm making now. She paused. And Marcus, this is not about one night. You know that. You have known that for a very long time. He stared at her, and underneath the fear, underneath the calculation, she saw something else pass across his face, brief and quickly suppressed, but there. Something that looked in the particular angle of that moment like remorse. Not the performed remorse of a man trying to recover a situation. The real kind. The kind that comes too late and knows it. I should have, he started. Don't, she said quietly. Not here, and honestly not at all. There's nothing to say tonight that changes anything. She moved past him. He didn't follow. She found her father near the center of the room speaking with two men she recognized from the real estate finance world. He glanced at her as she approached, and she gave him a small nod. The nod that communicated, I'm all right. I've got it. He returned it and continued his conversation without missing a beat, which was as much respect as Harrison Van Allen knew how to show, and more than enough. Her mother appeared at her side. How are you? Isabel asked. The question was simple and direct, with none of the layered implication that it might have carried in a different context. Just the question. Just her mother asking. I'm angry, Elara said. And I'm sad. And I'm clearer than I've been in a very long time. Isabel considered this. That's a good combination, she said finally. Is it— Anger without clarity is just noise, her mother said. Sadness without clarity is just grief. But anger and sadness together with clarity, that's how things get built. Elara looked at her mother, at the cream coat and the silver hair and the 68 years of absolute unperformed authority, at the woman who had stood in front of Chloe Vance 20 minutes ago and taken her apart with 3 sentences and warm eyes and a tone that never once rose above conversational. I need to call the Foundation's legal team, Elara said. Tomorrow morning, early. I already texted them, Isabel said. They're expecting your call at 7. Elara almost laughed, actually felt the laugh move through her. Not the brittle, desperate kind that lives near tears, but a real one, the kind that comes from recognizing something so essentially true about a person that there's nothing to do but love them for it. Mom, she said. I know, Isabel said. Across the room, Chloe was leaving. Elara saw it from the corner of her eye, the gold dress moving toward the exit faster than casual, without the confident ease it had carried 3 hours ago when that dress walked in. No goodbye to Marcus, no performance of departure. Just a woman who had catastrophically misread a room and was now trying to leave it before anyone looked too directly at her. Marcus was at the bar. He had a drink in his hand that he was not drinking. He was standing very still, which was unusual for him. Marcus Hayes was a man who moved constantly at these events, worked a room, circled back, refreshed conversations. Standing still was not something he did voluntarily. He looked for the first time, in as long as she could remember, like a man who didn't know what to do next. She felt the pity again. Let herself feel it this time, because suppressing it would have been a kind of dishonesty, and she was done with anything that resembled dishonesty. She had loved this man. She had loved him thoroughly and completely and beyond her own self-interest, and that love had been real, regardless of what had happened to it. Feeling pity for him now did not diminish her. It was simply part of the full, honest accounting of what they had been to each other. But pity and going back were two entirely different things, and she was not going back. The event was winding down around the edges, people collecting coats, finishing last glasses of champagne, beginning the careful social choreography of departure. Dorothy Fenn found her one more time before she left and put her hand briefly on Alara's arm and said, "I've been at these events for 31 years. I've seen a lot of things. Tonight was the first time I've ever seen Marcus Hayes not know what to say." She paused. "I thought you should know that." "Thank you," Alara said, "for the call." Dorothy looked at her steadily. "Your mother once did something similar for me, 22 years ago. Different situation, same principle." She squeezed her arm once. "Consider it returned." She was gone before Alara could ask what she meant, which was, she suspected, exactly how Dorothy intended it. Her father came to stand beside her at exactly the moment she needed him to, not because she had signaled, but because he was Harrison Van Allen, and he had been reading rooms for 50 years, and he read his daughters the way other people read headlines. "Ready?" he asked. She looked around the ballroom one last time, at the chandeliers and the thinning crowd and the space where Chloe had stood with her champagne glass and her manufactured confidence, now empty. At Marcus at the bar with his award on the counter beside him, and his drink in his hand, and his stillness that was not peace. At all of it. The whole long, expensive, humiliating, clarifying evening. "Yes," she said. They walked out together, her father on her right, her mother on her left, through the wide entrance of the ballroom and into the corridor, and the sound of the gala receded behind them like a tide going out. And Alara Van Allen Hayes walked with her spine straight and her hands completely, absolutely still, and something in her chest that had been closed for 8 years was open, fully open, breathing like a living thing. She did not look back. She did not need to. What was behind her was already finished. What was in front of her had not yet been built. And she was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly the person who was going to build it. The elevator doors opened, they stepped in, the doors closed, and in the gleaming metal surface of those doors, Alara caught her own reflection. Navy dress, clear eyes, the two people who had made her on either side of her, and she looked at herself for one full, honest second. And she thought, there you are. The Van Allen town car moved through the wet streets of Manhattan at 11:47 at night, and for the first 6 blocks, nobody said anything. That was all right. Alara had grown up understanding that the Van Allen family's silences were not empty. They were the kind of silences that had texture and weight, that did actual work, that processed things too large or too important for immediate language. She sat between her parents in the back of that car, and she let the silence do its work. And she watched the city move past the windows in streaks of yellow and red and the particular blue-gray of wet pavement under streetlights. Her mother spoke first. "You need to eat something." "I'm not hungry." "That wasn't a question about your hunger," Isabel said. Her father made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Alara looked at him, and he was looking straight ahead, and the corner of his mouth had done something that on Harrison Van Allen's face constituted a smile. She felt something loosen in her chest, something small and tight that had been there for 14 months. "Where are we going?" she asked. "The park," her father said, which meant the Van Allen suite at the plaza, which her parents kept year-round for New York trips, and which Alara had not set foot in since the week before her wedding. "Your mother called ahead. There's food." "Of course there is," Alara said. "Don't," her mother said mildly. "I wasn't—" "You were about to make a comment about planning," Isabel said. "I could hear it coming." It was going to be an affectionate comment. "It was going to be affectionate and slightly pointed," her mother said. "Save the pointed part. You've had enough sharp things tonight." Alara looked at her mother's profile in the passing light, at the set of her jaw, which was the specific set that meant Isabel Van Allen was managing an emotion she considered too large for the current container, and she understood fully for the first time since she had crossed the lobby and walked into her mother's arms that her parents had been afraid tonight. Not for the family name, not for the foundation, for her. Specifically, completely parentally afraid for their daughter, who had been standing in a ballroom being publicly destroyed while they were still 40 minutes away in a car on the FDR. "I'm okay," Alara said quietly. Her mother didn't answer immediately. Then, "I know you are. You're also allowed to not be, and I'd like you to know that both things are available to you." The car stopped in front of the plaza at 11:53. They went up. The suite was warm and lit, and there was food on the table, the way there was always food in spaces her mother had prepared, not elaborate, not performative, just right. Soup, bread, tea, the specific combination that Isabel Van Allen had deployed for every significant conversation in Alara's life that had required both honesty and sustenance. Alara sat down and ate, and it was only when the food was in front of her that she realized how hollow she had been running all evening, how much of herself the last several hours had cost her. Her father sat across from her with his hands around a coffee cup and let her eat. Her mother sat beside her and did the same. And when the bowl was half empty and the tea was in her hands and the worst of the hollow feeling had receded, her father set his cup down and said, "Tell me what you want. Not what are you going to do, not what should we do, what do you want?" The distinction was so precise and so exactly right that it made her throat close briefly. She thought about it honestly. Not the answer she was supposed to give, not the strategic answer or the dignified answer or the answer that would make the most sense to a room full of attorneys tomorrow morning. What she actually wanted. What Alara Van Allen, stripped of 8 years of careful smallness, actually wanted. "I want the divorce," she said. "Clean and fast and on terms that he will not enjoy but will not be able to argue with, because I want it over and I want to be done and I don't want it to take 2 years of my life in a courtroom." Her father nodded. "I want the Aldrich building protected," she said. "Not as leverage, because it's worth protecting, because that's what the foundation is for, and I should have said so 4 months ago when I first saw it on the list." "Done," her mother said simply. "And I want—" She stopped. This one was harder. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud to these two specific people in this specific room required a kind of courage that was different from the courage she had needed in the ballroom. That had been public courage performed under pressure. This was the other kind. The quiet, unglamorous kind. "I want to come back to the foundation. If there's still a place for me." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Her father looked at her mother. Her mother looked at her father, and something passed between them that was too private and too complete for Alara to fully read, but that she understood in its outline, the shape of two people who had been waiting for a specific sentence for a very long time, and were now deciding how to receive it without making her feel the weight of the waiting. "There has always been a place for you," her father said. "We left it open." Her mother put her hand over hers on the table and didn't say anything, which was more than enough. They talked for 2 more hours. Real talk, the kind she had not had with her parents since she was 23 years old, and sitting across from her father's desk, making the decision she had spent 8 years living inside. They talked about the foundation and its current projects and where it was going. They talked about the Aldrich building and 3 other properties on the preservation list and what the next grant cycle would prioritize. They talked about Marcus carefully, without cruelty, with the clinical precision of people who needed to understand the full scope of a situation in order to manage it correctly. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, around 1:30 in the morning, Alara said something she had not planned to say. "I don't regret marrying him," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Not for your benefit, for mine. I don't regret it. I loved him. What he became is not what I married, and what happened is not something I deserved. But I made my choices with full eyes, and I'd rather own them than pretend I was only ever a victim of his." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is the most Van Allen thing you have ever said." "Is that a compliment?" "From me." He looked at her steadily. "It's the highest one I have." She slept in her old room that night, the sweet second bedroom, which her mother had kept exactly as it was prepared whenever Alara stayed, with the specific pillow arrangement and the blackout curtains and the glass of water on the nightstand. She lay in the dark and listened to the city outside and felt the day moving through her in layers. The ballroom, Chloe's hand on her wrist, Marcus's turned back, the tear, Dorothy's phone call, the lobby, her mother's arms, Carver's handshake, Marcus's face when he understood what the Aldrich building meant, the elevator doors and her own reflection in the last moment before they closed. She did not sleep for a long time, but the not sleeping was different from the kind she had been doing for the last several years, the anxious, hollow vigilance of someone waiting for the next thing to go wrong. This was the awake of someone thinking, planning, feeling the actual dimensions of the space that had just opened up around her, and beginning tentatively carefully to understand how much room there was in it. At 7:15 the next morning, she called the Foundation's legal team. By 7:45, they had confirmed 3 things. The prenuptial agreement, while it limited her claim on marital assets, could not and did not touch her Van Allen inheritance, which her father had maintained in trust throughout the marriage. The Aldrich building's preservation status could be elevated to protected within the current grant cycle with a formal foundation recommendation. And Marcus Hayes's Meridian Project licensing review could be formally flagged for additional scrutiny based on the preservation conflict, which would delay approval by a minimum of 4 months and potentially significantly longer. 4 months was, she knew, the exact window within which Marcus's primary financing agreement had to close or forfeit. She had known this because she had once upon a time been the person who helped him draft the preliminary business plan. She had known it, and she had said nothing last night to Carver because she did not need to say it. Robert Carver had been running licensing reviews for 22 years. He could read a timeline. At 9 a.m., she met with her parents and the family's lead attorney, a woman named Patricia Wen, who had represented Van Allen interests for 16 years and who greeted Alara with a handshake that communicated she was fully briefed and entirely prepared. Patricia laid the divorce strategy out in 40 minutes, clear and efficient, and without unnecessary softening. The prenuptial agreement meant the financial separation was relatively straightforward. The complication was Marcus's potential claim on certain joint accounts established after the marriage and outside the prenuptial terms. Patricia had already identified 3 specific points of negotiation. "How quickly can we move?" Alara asked. "Filing can happen today," Patricia said, "if you want it to." "I want it to." Patricia nodded, made a note, and continued. By 10:30, the papers were filed. Alara held her phone in her hand for a moment after Patricia confirmed it and felt the weight of that action, the actual, legal, irreversible weight of it, and then set the phone face down on the table and breathed exactly the way her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old. In through the nose, out through the mouth, feel it, breathe, decide what comes next. Marcus's attorney called at 11:14. Patricia handled the call. Alara sat across the conference table and watched Patricia's face, which was professionally neutral and gave away nothing but whose pen was moving across a legal pad with increasing speed, which Alara had already learned meant things were happening faster than the other side had anticipated. When Patricia ended the call, she set down her pen and looked at Alara directly. "He wants to negotiate." "I assumed he would. He's offering to accelerate the settlement timeline in exchange for, and I want to be exact here, in exchange for the Foundation's position on the Aldrich building remaining neutral." The room was very quiet. Alara looked at Patricia. Patricia looked back at her with the expression of an attorney who has presented information and is now waiting for her client and not for anyone else to determine what it means. "He wants me to trade the Foundation's position for a faster divorce," Alara said. "That's the substance of it, yes. He wants me to leave a historically significant building unprotected so that his project can proceed, and in exchange, he'll sign divorce papers faster." She paused. "That's his offer?" "Yes." Alara was quiet for 10 seconds. Her father, sitting to her left, said nothing. Her mother, sitting to her right, said nothing. Patricia said nothing. The room waited. "Tell him no," Alara said. "Tell him the Foundation's position on the Aldrich building will be determined entirely by the Foundation's preservation criteria on its own timeline, without reference to any other matter. And tell him the divorce proceeds on our timeline regardless," Patricia wrote. "And if he decides to contest the divorce terms, then he can contest them. He has a prenuptial agreement and a wife whose family has been in New York law for 4 decades. He can make that calculation and see where it lands him." Patricia almost smiled. It was very brief and very professional, but it was there. "Understood," she said. At 1 p.m., Ilara's phone showed a text from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't open it. Then she did. It was from Chloe Vance. She stared at Chloe's name on her screen for a full 5 seconds before she opened the message. It read, "I know you have no reason to listen to me, but I need you to know that he told me you were separated. He told me for over a year that the marriage was over in every way that mattered, and that you both knew it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking you to know that I was lied to, too." Ilara read the message twice. Then she set the phone face down on the table slowly and sat with the information it contained. She had not until this moment considered what Marcus had told Chloe. She had constructed Chloe in her mind as a straightforward architect of cruelty, a woman who had known exactly what she was doing and had done it with full information. The possibility that Chloe had been operating inside her own version of Marcus's lies was something she had not given room to. It didn't excuse the ballroom. Nothing excused the ballroom, the wrist-grab the microphone moment, the invisible and the baggage, and the deliberate public performance of cruelty. Those were Chloe's choices made in the full knowledge that Ilara was standing there. But it complicated the story. It made Chloe something other than purely a villain. It made her in some ways another person Marcus Hayes had decided he could afford to use. She picked up the phone. She typed, "I heard what you said last night. What you did. I'm not in a position to tell you that's acceptable because it wasn't. But if he lied to you about the marriage, then you should know he lied to you about other things too. Get a lawyer. And find out exactly what he told you in writing versus what was true." She paused, then added, "I won't be in contact again after this." She sent it. She put the phone away. Her mother, who had seen her type without asking what she was typing, said nothing for a moment. Then, "That was generous." "It was honest," Ilara said. "There's a difference. Sometimes they're the same thing." At 3 p.m., Patricia called with news that she described as significant and that Ilara needed to understand before it became public. Marcus's primary financing partner for the Meridian Project, a private equity firm based in Connecticut, had contacted Marcus that morning to request an emergency review meeting. The stated reason was new information regarding the project's regulatory timeline. The unstated reason, which Patricia had from a contact at the firm, was that the firm's senior partner had attended the gala the previous evening and had watched the entire sequence of events with the kind of attention that private equity partners apply to situations involving the hidden identities of relevant stakeholders. In other words, the money had seen what happened in the ballroom, and the money was reconsidering. "The financing review meeting is tomorrow," Patricia said. "There's a reasonable probability, and I want to be careful about how strongly I say this, that the firm will trigger the material change clause in the financing agreement." Ilara knew what the material change clause meant. It meant the financing could be withdrawn. It meant the Meridian project without its primary capital partner and with its licensing review now flagged was facing a timeline that Marcus's business model could not survive intact. It meant that the award he had accepted last night, the crystal piece that had been sitting on the bar while his marriage dissolved around him, was going to become very quickly a monument to the highest point before the fall. She felt the pity again, let it move through her, and kept going. "What about the award itself?" she asked. "The Developer of the Year, can it be rescinded?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. The Northeast Development Coalition has a conduct clause in their award criteria. It's rarely invoked, but Robert Carver is the chairman of the review committee. Ilara absorbed this. "I'm not asking for it to be rescinded," she said carefully. "I'm asking whether it can be, because I want to understand the full landscape. I'm not interested in pursuing every possible consequence for its own sake. I'm interested in what's right." "That's a useful distinction," Patricia said. "And yes, it can be." At 5 p.m., Ilara went for a walk. Alone, she needed to be alone, needed the specific freedom of moving through the city without an agenda or an audience. She walked through the park, which was gray and wet from the previous night's rain, and almost entirely empty. And she walked for 40 minutes without destination, just moving, just feeling the ground under her feet and the cold air on her face, and the full, complicated weight of everything the last 18 hours had been. She thought about Marcus as she walked. Not the Marcus of last night, the man at the bar with his crystal award, and his stillness and his face when he understood about the Aldrich building. The Marcus before that. The Marcus of before everything. The young man who had spilled a tray of champagne at a Boston charity auction and spent 5 minutes apologizing with such genuine self-deprecating humor that she had laughed for the first time in months. That Marcus had been real. She needed to hold on to that not as a reason to doubt her decisions, but as evidence that what she had loved had been worth loving, that her judgment had not been simply wrong from the beginning. What had happened to him was a story she did not fully know and would probably never fully know. Success did things to people that were hard to predict. Some people it expanded. Some people it revealed. Marcus. It had revealed to be a man who, when freed from the constraints of needing others, had discovered he preferred a version of himself that required no accountability. That was not something she could have seen at 24. It was barely something she could have named at 32. All she could do now was name it clearly and move. She stopped walking. She was standing near the edge of the park, the city loud and ordinary around her yellow taxis and delivery bikes, and a woman pushing a stroller, and 2 teenagers arguing about something on a phone. All of it completely indifferent to the last 24 hours of her life. All of it moving, continuing, utterly uninterested in her specific crisis and its specific resolution. She found this unexpectedly deeply comforting. She had been so long in a marriage that made her feel like the most visible, invisible person in the world, constantly observed, constantly assessed, constantly found wanting. That the anonymity of the sidewalk felt like rest. Nobody here knew she was Harrison Van Allen's daughter. Nobody here knew about the gala, or the ballroom, or the navy dress, or the tear that Chloe Vance had pointed to as evidence of her inadequacy. She was just a woman standing on a New York sidewalk at 5 in the afternoon, breathing the October air, deciding what she wanted her life to look like. She thought about the foundation, about what her father had said they left the place open, about the Aldrich building and the 3 other properties on the list and the grant cycle and the preservation work that was unglamorous and essential and exactly the kind of thing that she had been raised to consider worth doing. She thought about what she wanted to build, not what she was owed, not what she deserved as redress for everything she had endured, not the satisfaction of watching Marcus's project collapse, which was coming whether she orchestrated it or not. What she actually genuinely, with the full force of her attention and her capability and her name, wanted to build. She knew the answer. She had known it for longer than she had admitted to herself. She took out her phone and called her father. He picked up on the second ring. "I want to lead the Foundation's New York division," she said, "not as a symbolic role, as the actual director, with full authority over the preservation grant cycle and the funding strategy. I want to rebuild the historical initiative from the ground up, and I want to do it here in this city where I can do the most damage, the good kind." Her father was silent for exactly 3 seconds. The specific 3 seconds of Harrison Van Allen processing something he has already decided and is simply confirming. "When can you start?" he asked. "Monday," she said. "I'll have the office ready by Sunday night." She ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk for another moment. The city moved around her indifferent and alive. Then she straightened her spine, that same motion, that exact same motion from the ballroom, and she turned north and she started walking. The sun was beginning to drop behind the buildings to the west, and the light it threw across the city was long and gold and without apology. And Alara Van Allen walked through it with her hands in her pockets and her eyes forward, and the full, clean, unencumbered weight of her own name settling around her shoulders, like something she had carried before and had simply forgotten she knew how to wear. Behind her, in an office on the 43rd floor of a building in the financial district, a private equity firm was preparing a letter that Marcus Hayes had not yet received and would not enjoy reading. In a licensing office downtown, a flag had been placed on a file marked Meridian Development Project, Fulton Street. In a hotel suite 2 miles away, Patricia Wen was reviewing documents that would ensure Alara left this marriage with everything the law permitted, and several things Marcus had not anticipated the law permitting. And in a glass-walled conference room in Midtown, Robert Carver was on the phone with 2 members of the Northeast Development Coalition's Award Review Committee discussing a clause that had not been invoked in 11 years and was about to be invoked now. Alara did not know all of this yet. She would know it by morning. But walking through the gold October light on the edge of Central Park, she felt it the way you feel weather changing before you can see the clouds, the way you feel the turn of something large and slow and permanent shifting beneath the ordinary surface of things. The invisible wife, not invisible, never invisible, just finally, irrevocably, completely seen. The letter arrived at Marcus Hayes's office at 8:47 on Monday morning. Patricia Wen had timed it deliberately, not vindictively, she had explained to Alara, but strategically. Monday morning before the week built its own momentum before Marcus had a chance to establish the week's narrative. The letter was 12 pages. It outlined the divorce terms, the foundation's formal position on the Aldrich building, and 3 specific financial irregularities that Patricia's team had identified over the weekend in the joint accounts Marcus had established outside the prenuptial agreement. The irregularities were not criminal, but they were exactly the kind of thing that, in the hands of a skilled attorney with full Van Allen resources behind her, became extraordinarily expensive to explain. Alara knew the letter had been delivered because Patricia texted her at 8:49, confirmed received. And then 4 minutes later, his attorney called already. They want to meet this week. She was standing in her new office when she read those texts. The Van Allen Foundation's New York division occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Park Avenue, and her office had a window that looked north toward the park, and the morning light was coming through it at an angle that made the room feel larger than it was. She had been here since 7:15, which was not because she was anxious, but because she had too much energy for sleep, and her body had decided that forward movement was the only appropriate response to everything the last 72 hours had been. She typed back to Patricia, schedule it for Wednesday. Our offices. And make sure he has to come to us. Patricia responded with a single word. Done. She set her phone down and looked at the desk in front of her. Her desk in her office in the foundation her family had built, and felt something settle into place in her chest with the quiet, permanent satisfaction of a key finding the lock it was made for. Her assistant, a young woman named Grace, who had been with the New York office for 3 years and who had greeted Alara that morning with the careful professionalism of someone who had been briefed and was choosing to let Alara's actions speak for themselves rather than making assumptions, knocked on the open door at 9 o'clock. The Preservation Committee is ready when you are, Grace said. Conference room B, and Mr. Carver's office called. He'd like to schedule a call this afternoon if you're available. Tell him 2 o'clock, Alara said, and tell the committee I'll be there in 5 minutes. She picked up the Aldrich building file, which she had spent Sunday reading in its entirety, 340 pages of architectural history, previous preservation assessments, community impact studies, and the 2-page summary that someone on the previous committee cycle had attached with a note reading, "Borderline case, recommend further review." She had read that note 3 times, borderline. As though a building that had been standing on Fulton Street since 1887, that had survived 2 world wars and the Great Depression and September 11th and 40 years of New York real estate pressure, was borderline worth saving. She walked into the conference room with the file under her arm and the clear, specific energy of a woman who has made a decision and is now in the business of executing it. And the 4 people sitting around the table looked up at her, and she watched them recalibrate, not dramatically, but in the small, instinctive way that people recalibrate when the person walking through the door carries more authority than the room was expecting. "Good morning," she said, and sat down. "I've read the full file. The Aldrich building is not a borderline case. I want to walk through why, and then I want to talk about how we accelerate the formal recommendation before the licensing committee's review window closes." One of the committee members, a man named Arthur, whom she vaguely remembered from foundation events years ago, leaned forward slightly. The previous committee's assessment was incomplete, she said. The 1887 construction records weren't cross-referenced with the city's original infrastructure mapping from that period. When you do that, cross-referencing the building's foundational role in the Fulton Street commercial corridor becomes historically significant rather than incidental. She opened the file. Page 47, the cross-reference data. I had our research team pull it yesterday. Arthur looked at page 47. Then he looked up at her. And in his expression, she saw the thing she had been hoping to see, not deference, which she didn't want, but recognition. The recognition of a professional encountering another professional who has done the work. That changes the assessment, he said. Yes, she said, it does. The committee meeting lasted 90 minutes. By the end of it, the formal recommendation to elevate the Aldrich Building's preservation status was drafted and ready for signature. It would go to the licensing committee before the end of the week, well ahead of the Meridian Project's flagged review timeline. At 2 o'clock, she took Robert Carver's call. "I heard you're in the office," he said without preamble. He had that quality, the quality of a man who considered small talk a form of inefficiency. She appreciated it. "As of this morning," she said, "the Aldrich recommendation. Signed and submitted an hour ago." A pause. "The licensing committee meets Thursday. The Meridian review is on the agenda." Another pause briefer. "The recommendation will be in front of them before then." "That was the intention," she said. "Hayes's attorney contacted my office this morning," Carver said. "They were communicative about the Foundation's position and its timing." "I imagine they were." "I want to be clear, Alara. My committee's decision will be based on the licensing criteria and the preservation recommendation. Nothing else. Whatever else is happening, the personal dimensions of this situation that doesn't enter into it." "I know that," she said. "That's why I submitted the recommendation on its merits. If the Aldrich Building didn't qualify on its own terms, I wouldn't have submitted it." "I know," he said. And then after a beat, "Your father raised you right." "My mother raised me right," she said. "My father taught me how to walk into rooms." Carver made a sound that was definitively a laugh. Brief, genuine, the laugh of a man who didn't do it often enough. 2 o'clock Thursday, he said. "You're not a party to the review, but if you want to be available by phone, I'll have my phone on all day," she said. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving, generating, processing itself with the relentless productive energy of a place that had decided a long time ago that momentum was a moral position. She had grown up inside that energy and had spent 8 years trying to exist at the edge of someone else's version of it. Now she was generating her own. Her phone rang again. This time it was a number she recognized as Dorothy Fenn's. "I heard you're in the office," Dorothy said. Exactly as Carver had said it, which made Alara understand that her Monday morning arrival had been noted in certain circles with the speed of information that only traveled that fast in New York when people were watching for it. "Word travels," Alara said. "In this city, word doesn't travel. It teleports." Dorothy paused. "I want to ask you something. The Young Philanthropists Forum, they have their annual dinner in December. They've been looking for a keynote speaker for 3 months, the person they had canceled 2 weeks ago. I sit on the advisory board." Alara understood what was being offered. The Young Philanthropists Forum was not a small dinner. It was 300 people, significant press coverage, the kind of platform that, especially in December, in the particular news cycle that followed major events in the New York development world, would be precisely, specifically, strategically visible. She also understood that Dorothy was not doing this entirely out of personal warmth, though the warmth was real. Dorothy Fenn was a woman who invested in things she believed would grow. She was placing a bet. "I'd be honored," Alara said. "Good," Dorothy said. "I'll send the details. And Alara, make it count. Don't be modest. You've spent enough time being modest." She hung up before Alara could respond, which was, she was beginning to understand simply Dorothy's style. Wednesday came. Marcus arrived at the Van Allen Foundation offices at 10 a.m. with his attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who wore his competence like a suit that fit well, but had been made for a slightly different body. Alara sat across the conference table with Patricia Wen beside her and her father 1 chair down on her left, and she watched Marcus walk into the room, and she watched what the room did to him. He had aged since Friday night. Not dramatically, not years and days the way people aged in stories. But there was something around his eyes and in the set of his mouth that had not been there 48 hours ago. the particular exhaustion of a man who has been running calculations all weekend and has not liked a single result. He sat down. He looked at Alara, and she held his gaze steadily without anger and without warmth, with the clear, neutral attention of a woman conducting business. "I want to say something," Marcus said, and Gerald Foss touched his arm briefly. The attorney's reflex, "Don't speak without direction," but Marcus shook him off slightly. "Before we get into the documents, I want to say something." Patricia looked at Alara. Alara gave her the smallest nod. "Go ahead," Alara said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the table rather than at her, and she could see him finding words the way you find footing on uncertain ground, carefully testing each one before committing weight. "What happened Friday night?" he said. "What she said to you, what I didn't do." He stopped, started again. "I've been trying to find the version of that I can live with, and I can't. There isn't one. I stood there, and I let that happen. And I know there's nothing I can say that changes it. I just needed you to know that I know." The room was very quiet. Alara looked at him, at the man who had spilled champagne at a Boston charity auction and apologized with such genuine humor that she had laughed for the first time in months, at the man who had become something else slowly and completely over 8 years of success and self-permission, at the man who was sitting across from her now with the exhausted eyes of someone who had finally, too late, completed an honest accounting of himself. "I hear you," she said. "Not I forgive you. Not it's all right, I hear you." The most honest thing she could offer, offered cleanly. Marcus nodded. He looked back at the table. "Okay," he said. "Let's talk about the documents." The meeting lasted 3 hours. Gerald Foss was good. Patricia had been right that he was skilled, and the negotiation was real, with genuine points of contention, and several moments where the temperature in the room rose and required management. But the fundamental position never shifted. Alara had come in knowing exactly what she would accept and exactly what she would not. And she sat in that knowledge with the calm of someone who has done the math beforehand and is simply waiting for the other party to reach the same conclusions. The breaking point came at the 2-hour mark over a joint account that Marcus's team maintained was outside the prenuptial terms and that Patricia maintained was not. Gerald argued for 20 minutes. Patricia responded for 7. Then she placed 3 documents on the table, the account establishment records, the prenuptial terms, and a legal brief she had prepared over the weekend, and she let them speak. Gerald read the brief. His expression, which had been professionally composed throughout, did something small and involuntary at the bottom of page 2. He whispered something to Marcus. Marcus read the relevant section. And then Marcus did something that Alara had genuinely not expected. He pushed the documents back toward Gerald, and he looked at Alara directly, and he said, "Give her the account." Gerald turned to him. "Marcus." "Give her the account," Marcus said again. His voice was flat and final. "All of it. We're done." Alara looked at him across the table. She did not say thank you. It was not a gift. It was what was correct, and he knew it, and acknowledging it as a gift would have been dishonest. But she held his gaze for a moment, and in that moment she let him see that she understood what it had cost him to say it without being forced to. That she recognized the difference between a man who fights to the end over something he knows he doesn't deserve and a man who doesn't. The documents were finalized and initialed before 5 o'clock. Marcus left first. He stood at the door for a moment with his hand on the frame, and he looked back at her one time, and she looked at him, and everything that had ever been between them, 8 years of it, all of it, the champagne at the charity auction, and the years of believing, and the years of not being believed in, and the ballroom and the tear, and all of it passed between them in that single silent look. Then he was gone. Patricia packed her briefcase. Alara's father, who had not spoken during the meeting except once a single quiet comment during the account dispute that had communicated more than most people's paragraphs, put his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed. Her mother, who had been in the adjacent office and had not come in, appeared in the doorway and looked at her with the specific expression that asked, "How are you?" without using the words. "Done," Alara said. "Done." Her mother agreed. Thursday at 2:17 p.m., Robert Carver called. She picked up before the second ring. "The committee completed the Meridian review," he said. She did not say anything. She waited. The licensing approval has been placed on extended hold pending resolution of the preservation conflict with the Aldrich Building. The hold is indefinite contingent on the Foundation's formal recommendation timeline. A pause. Additionally, the material change clause in the primary financing agreement was triggered this morning by the Connecticut firm. The Meridian project is effectively suspended. She had known this was coming. She had understood since Monday morning that the sequence of events was moving in this direction. But knowing something is coming and hearing it confirmed were two different things, and she sat with the confirmation for a moment and let it be real. "Thank you for calling personally," she said. "One more thing," Carver said. The award review committee met Tuesday morning. There was a unanimous decision to suspend the Developer of the Year recognition, pending the project review outcome and a separate conduct review under the coalition's ethics clause. A beat. The suspension was unanimous. I wanted you to know that. She set the phone down very carefully on her desk. She put both hands flat on the surface in front of her. She breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. She felt the full weight of the last 7 days moving through her in one long, slow wave. Everything that had happened, everything that had been lost, everything that was over, everything that had begun. She did not feel triumph. She had been right when she imagined this moment in the abstract, that triumph would not be the thing. What she felt was something more complex and more honest. Relief? Yes. Clarity? Absolutely. But also the specific sober weight of consequence, the weight of understanding that when things fall, they fall on real people, and that even when the falling is justified, even when it is the direct result of choices those people made themselves, it is still real and still heavy and still deserves to be felt as such. She gave herself 5 minutes for that feeling. Exactly 5 minutes in the quiet of her office with the afternoon light coming through the north window and the city moving beyond it with its permanent indifferent energy. Then she opened her laptop and started working. The December keynote came faster than she expected. The weeks between Thursday's call and the forum dinner moved with the specific velocity of a life that has found its direction and is no longer wasting energy on resistance. She worked 12-hour days that did not feel like 12-hour days. She rebuilt the New York Division's preservation strategy from its foundational assumptions upward, brought in 2 new research consultants, established a formal partnership with the city's Landmarks Commission, and identified 7 additional properties in the 5 boroughs that the Foundation's previous cycle had insufficiently evaluated. The Aldrich Building's protection was formalized in the 3rd week of November. She was in the office when the confirmation came through, and she read it twice, and then she called her mother. "The Aldrich Building," she said. "I know," her mother said. "Grace called me." "Grace called you. She's very efficient," her mother said, and Alara could hear the smile in it. "How do you feel?" "Like this is the beginning of something," Alara said. "Not the end." "That's exactly what it is," her mother said. The forum dinner was on the 2nd Thursday of December at a hotel 3 blocks from the Meridian Grand, which Alara noted with a private, complicated amusement. She wore a deep green dress that she had bought specifically for this evening, not expensive in the way the gala had been expensive, not the armor of diamonds and designed impact. Just a dress she had chosen for herself because she liked the color and the cut and the way it felt to wear something that was entirely her own choice. She stood at the podium in front of 300 people, and the room was the kind of quiet that rooms become when they are paying genuine attention rather than performing it. And she looked out at the faces, philanthropist foundation directors, city officials, journalists, several people she recognized from the October Gala, who were now looking at her with expressions very different from the ones they had worn that night, and she began. "I want to talk about visibility," she said, "not the kind that comes from being the loudest voice in a room, the other kind, the kind that comes from doing the work that nobody photographs in the buildings, that nobody notices for communities that have been told for too long that what they have is not worth saving." She spoke for 22 minutes. She spoke about the Aldrich Building and what it represented not just architecturally, but as a principle. She spoke about the communities whose history lived in buildings like it and what it meant when those buildings disappeared and what it cost in ways that couldn't be calculated in square footage or development revenue. She spoke about what foundations were for, not the performance of philanthropy, not the social currency of generosity, but the unglamorous, essential, perpetual work of deciding that certain things mattered and then doing what was necessary to protect them. She did not speak about Marcus. She did not speak about the gala, or the ballroom, or the navy dress, or the tear. Those were not the story she was telling tonight. Tonight she was telling the story of what she was building, not what she had survived. When she finished, the room came up. Not politely, not automatically. It came up the way rooms come up when something real has been said, when people have heard something they recognized as true and are responding to the truth of it, rather than the performance. She stood at the podium for a moment and let it land. Let herself feel it fully, completely, without deflecting or managing it. She had spent 8 years deflecting and managing feelings she deserved to feel. She was done with that. Dorothy Fenn found her 40 minutes later near the edge of the reception with a champagne glass in one hand and the expression of a woman whose bet has paid exactly the return she projected. "Well," Dorothy said. "Well," Alara agreed. "3 journalists asked me for your contact information. I gave them Grace's email." She sipped her champagne. "The Times is running a profile. Did you know that—" Grace mentioned someone had called. "The Philanthropic Sector column, Sunday edition." Dorothy looked at her steadily. "You're going to be very busy." "I know," Alara said. "Good." Dorothy paused. "You should know something. The people in this room, the ones who were at the gala in October, the ones who watched what happened, they've been talking about it for 2 months. Not the way I expected them to talk about it. Not the gossip version." She tilted her head slightly. "They've been talking about you, about what you did afterward, about Monday morning and the Aldrich building and the committee and the keynote tonight." She set her champagne glass down on a passing tray. "You've made a very particular impression, Alara, the kind that doesn't come from one night, the kind that comes from what you do with the night after the bad one." Alara looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for the phone call, in October, that night." "I told you," Dorothy said. "Your mother did something similar for me. 22 years ago, different situation, same principle." She paused. "She stood up for me in a room full of people who had decided I wasn't worth standing up for. I've been looking for the right moment to return it ever since." She smiled, the full smile, not the sharp social one, the real one. "I'm glad it was you." She walked away. Alara stood with the weight of that for a moment. The chain of it, the way one person's courage 22 years ago in a room she hadn't been in had rippled forward to this room this night. The way things connected, even when you couldn't see the connections. Her phone vibrated. A text from her father Proud doesn't cover it. "See you Sunday. Bring the green dress. Your mother wants a photograph." She laughed, genuinely quietly, the kind of laugh that comes from being known by someone. She put the phone back in her pocket and stood in the room for another moment. Around her, the forum dinner continued its quiet energy. People talked and drank and made the specific connections that these rooms existed to make. The city pressed against the windows in its relentless way. She thought about the girl in her mother's garden learning the Latin names of roses. She thought about the woman who had walked away from everything that garden represented because she believed in someone, and that had been a real belief genuinely held. She thought about the 8 years of being made small, incrementally, so gradually, that she had almost forgotten she was doing it to herself as much as having it done to her. She thought about a ballroom and a tear and a woman in a gold dress who had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She thought about Monday morning and the light in the north-facing window, and the Aldrich building file under her arm, and the committee meeting, and Patricia's brief, and the documents initialed before 5 o'clock, and Carver's call on Thursday, and the keynote 22 minutes ago, and the room that came up came all the way up for something true. And she thought about what her mother had said in the Plaza Suite 3 days after the worst night of her recent life. Anger and sadness together with clarity, that's how things get built. She understood that now, in a way she hadn't fully understood it then, not as a comfort, not as a strategy, but as a simple structural truth about what she was made of and what she was here to do. She was Alara Van Allen, director of the Van Allen Foundation's New York division, protector of the Aldrich building and 7 others like it, and everyone that came after, keynote speaker, her mother's daughter, her father's daughter, a woman who had given 8 years to someone who had decided she was invisible, and who had discovered in the rubble of that decision that she had never been invisible at all. She had simply been surrounded for too long by people who could not afford to see her clearly. They could see her now. Every person in this room could see her. And tomorrow, they would still see her, and the day after, and the December Sunday when the Times profile ran, and 300 more people learned her name, and the grant cycle when the Aldrich Building's protection was published, and the development world understood fully, and finally what the Van Allen Foundation's position meant for the future of this city's history. They would see her in every room she walked into, and she would not be small in any of them, and she would not deflect, and she would not manage, and she would not stand 3 feet from anyone who was erasing her and count to 4 and then walk quietly away. She was done with quiet. She was done with invisible. She was done with the version of herself that had spent 8 years being careful not to take up too much space in someone else's story. She picked up a champagne glass from a passing tray. She looked at it for a moment at the bubbles rising in their slow, patient lines to the surface, exactly as they had in the Meridian Grand Ballroom 2 months ago, when she had set a glass down untouched and walked across a marble floor toward a truth she already knew. She looked at them and she thought patience, even in small things, eventually arrives at the surface. Then she raised the glass. Not to anyone in particular. Not to the room. Not to the night. Not to whatever version of justice had spent 2 months quietly assembling itself out of consequences and decisions, and one phone call from a woman who remembered a debt. She raised it to herself. To the woman she had been before, who had been worth more than she was given credit for. To the woman she was now, who had decided to take the credit regardless. She drank. And Alara Van Allen set the empty glass down on the table, and she stood in her green dress in the light of a December evening, and she was exactly who she had always been. Not rescued, not restored, not returned to some prior state as though the 8 years were a mistake to be corrected and forgotten. Changed. Forged. Sharpened by everything she had carried and clarified by everything she had chosen to put down. The Invisible Wife was a story someone else had told about her. It had never been true. And now finally, completely on her own terms, in her own voice, with her own name, the real story had begun.